afternoon. Welcome to Capital Account. I'm Lauren Lister here in Washington, D.C. These are your headlines for Wednesday, September 12th, 2012. Germany's constitutional court ruled the ESM, which is the Eurozone's permanent bailout fund, does not violate the country's law, ruling against plaintiffs that were reportedly spanning the entire political spectrum who alleged that it in fact did. But what is next? The big question. Meanwhile, the European Commission president called for a federation of nation-states and unveiled plans for the ECB to supervise all Eurozone banks. But was the lack of a centralized banking regulator what caused the debt crisis? And is more integration a solution? We'll speak to member of European Parliament and UK Independence Party member Godfrey Bloom. And despite more attempts at integration and consolidation in Europe, there are more signs of fracture running parallel. For example, while Spain reportedly mulls whether or not the country will need ECB bond buying, which would enter Spain into the ECB workhouse, the crisis at the same time reportedly fuels the independence movement in the Spanish region of Catalonia. We'll have more. Let's get to today's Capital Account. Today, more hocus pocus in Europe to report. The ESM is upheld, but the decision adds a cap, reportedly making large-scale bailouts cost prohibitive. It also reinforced Bundestag veto power over activation, and Jose Manuel Barroso, in his State of the Union speech, called for deeper integration in Europe. But in reaction, we feel it was Nigel Farage that put it best.
You make it clear that whilst you think the nation state should continue to exist, it mustn't have any democratic powers.
Yet the euro responded positively. Another example of this. And that example would be markets responding to policymakers, not fundamentals, where up has become down, left is right, and the world resembles more of a wonderland than reality. Well, earlier today, for some reality, I talked to Godfrey Bloom, member of the European Parliament and UK Independence Party member. First, I asked about the ESM ruling, which he thinks was more driven by politics than the law.
Well, I think one of the problems we had, this came as no surprise to us, Lauren, in point of fact, that the German Constitutional Court would come to this view, because there's been an awful lot of overturning of countries' constitutions, my own country as being one. It's quite illegal, our membership of the European Union under our own constitution. So this came as no surprise to us for this to be fudged, because we're now in a situation where a great number of the senior judges in European countries are political appointees. So, of course, he who pays the piper calls the tune.
I see. Okay, so you think there's a little bit of collusion, to put it, I guess, a little bit more aggressively there. Speaking of kind of this direction towards technocracy and consolidation, in Jose Manuel Barroso's State of the Union address, in his prepared remarks, he stated, "We will need to move towards a federation of nation states." And he also said, in the age of globalisation, pooled sovereignty means more power, not less. How do you interpret this statement? Is it implying that somehow, because the world has become more integrated, that super states take over the role once reserved for the nation state?
Well, it's very frightening, isn't it, what he was saying? And he came out with a phrase which we thought was absolutely fabulous, which was extreme populism. Now, I'm not quite sure what extreme populism means, but I would argue that that's called democracy to you and I, and he calls it extreme populism. So we all thought that was highly amusing. But of course, what you also have to understand, that there isn't a history of democracy that an American or an Englishman would understand in this place. Your democracy in America there, for example, over there where you are in Washington, goes back several hundred years. Now it goes back something like 800, as we understand it now. It's moved and advanced over those number of years. parliamentary democracy in the European Union is extremely new. We have an awful lot of countries who've just come out of the Soviet system, and of course there were a number of countries, of course, and within my living memory, and I'm getting a bit old now, my living memory were in point of fact fascist. So, you know, there was Franco in Spain, there was Dr. Salazar in Portugal, so there was a fascist element. So democracy in the European Union is something which is relatively new.
I see. So you think it's the newness of it, and it ranges on people being able to call it extreme populism, what maybe you or I would consider the democratic process. Now, the European Commission also unveiled sweeping plans for the European Central Bank to supervise all Eurozone banks today. Now, Germany immediately raised objections. I know the UK has objections to the proposals. One of the risks is that the ECB will be overstretched. Reasonable to understand why there are, I believe, 6,000 banks it would be overseeing. Do you believe that the lack of such supervision has caused or contributed to the crisis?
Well, we have a problem where neither the Commission here, neither the ECB, neither the politicians here fully understand international banking and fiat currencies. This is the problem. Now, what I'm facing in my committee, my parliamentary committee, and what the Commission is facing is that they cannot face the truth of the matter, and that is fundamental economics. And I'm a professional economist now, or have been, I'm in politics now, but that's not my main field. I'm a financial economist. And what they will not accept, and don't seem to want to accept, is that if a country spends more money than it raises in tax revenue, it will eventually go broke. It's no different to you or me, or our families, or a small business. Sovereign states simply will go broke if they continue to spend more money than they raise. Now, the view here in the European Union Commission and the Parliament and the committees and the ECB is somehow we've been struck by a meteorite. Somehow it's a tsunami. Somehow this is an act of God. They do not yet associate the fact that we have a financial crisis in Europe is because that sovereign states spend more money than they gain in revenue, and that's what's called that's caused the banking crisis. Fractional reserve banking that lends money, the commercial banks lend money they don't have. It's fueled by central banks, of course, who manipulate interest rates, and isn't it funny that they're getting very cross about some of the accusations of commercial banks, manipulating interest rates. Well, of course, the greatest manipulators of interest rates are central banks.
Then let's get more into that. Let's switch over to Draghi, because he recently said that the OMT, which everyone knows by now is the unlimited bond buying program announced last week, that this would seek to address distortions in financial markets. And this is a pretty stunning statement, since markets have become completely dependent on the actions of governments and central banks, which would imply that it is Draghi and his fellow policymakers, in fact, that are creating the very distortions that their actions are purported to address. What do you think? Do you agree with that?
Yes, of course, you're absolutely right. What we have here is extreme moral hazard. We have a situation where governments have spent more money than they've actually raised in revenue. They've gone broke, banks have gone broke, so what they're doing is monetizing the debt. So they are making, in effect, the taxpayer pick up the tab for failed commercial banks, which of course I would argue is immoral. Banks should be allowed to fail. We're already now talking about, in my chamber this afternoon, of banking insurance, deposit insurance, and the people here have no idea how that works. Of course, if you have deposit insurance for a bank, the system they're suggesting is it is underwritten yet again by the taxpayer. So we haven't moved away this because people don't understand how the system works. In fact, if you sit round the average dinner party table in Europe, you won't find, it doesn't matter how well educated people are, they won't have the slightest idea how the banking system works and why we're in the mess to start with. And if we don't understand why we're in this mess to start with, there's no possible hope of us getting out of it.
Yeah, they can look to the U.S. for a lot of lessons on many of the things that you just talked about with deposit insurance and some of these bailouts. Now, following on this point, I also want to ask, it seems that the preferred creditor status of an ESM bailout, that is that the ESM is the creditor first in line to be paid by whoever it bails out ahead of other creditors, it seems that this distinction adds further to these distortions in markets we're talking about. What impact do you think this will have on the market?
Well, I mean, what they're trying to do is to give the implication that there's some form of gold-plated guarantee along the line to bring private investors into buying bonds. Well, they're not going to do that. If the private citizens who buy bonds, or private investment houses buy bonds, which are actually junk status, if they don't have at least joint status as investors, and if the ECB or any ECB agency has priority over them as creditors, they won't invest. So all that'll happen is you'll find in about 6 or 7 weeks the market will actually understand what's going on, and they'll turn their back on it. I mean, most of these sovereign debt bonds of Portugal, Greece, Ireland, Spain and Italy are verging on junk status. Well, most of them are junk status. And so consequently, there's no reason to invest in them, especially at the coupons that they give. I mean, you know, would you lend the Spanish government money for sort of, 10 years on 5% or 6%? I mean, it's absurd. No serious private investor would go near it.
You know, that's a really interesting point. I want to touch on that on the end, but first I want to bring in the political implications, because there seems to be this similar dynamic with the market trying to break out despite the policymakers constantly trying to smooth things over, and the markets go along with it for a while but then figure out what's going on, and then these fractures emerge. It's kind of similar politically, because with these moves towards integration in Europe, you see both moves from countries that would keep on this plan towards integration. You have Spain's Prime Minister, for example, indicating they're figuring out whether or not they need help from the ECB's bond buying program, which would, of course, tie them further to integration because they'd be in a so-called program. They would have certain terms they need to meet. But you also see more fractures. There's an FT story, for example, that the crisis is fueling the independence movement in the Spanish region of Catalonia. Is there a different response to integration at the federal level of these EU countries versus the regions within those countries?
Well, I think one of the major problems we have is that nobody actually signed up to this. When the original idea of the European Union came into being, it was regarded as a single market. It would bring down tariffs, so it would facilitate trade. And that is what the people of the European Union have been told since its inception, or certainly since the British joined in 1972. And of course, now it transpires that what this is all about is political union and a single state and a single superstate. But of course, as you know, it isn't based on the sort of system that is in the United States. It's more of an old Soviet system. It is centralized. There's a drive for harmonization of taxes, because they actually use phrases like tax competition. They don't understand that if politicians didn't have some of rein back on the taxes that they were allowed to raise, they would raise taxes to 120%. That's what politicians do. And so nobody's been addressed. Nobody feels they've been asked about this. And of course, we have free movement of labour, which you might argue as an Austrian libertarian might be a good idea, but it doesn't work with welfarism, Lauren. The problem is they haven't readdressed welfarism. So you have people going from the east of Europe into the west of Europe or north of Europe, where the welfare systems are significantly better. And until you reform welfare, you know, you're always going to have an immigration problem, because it's economic immigration, and that causes disturbances to cultures.
Still ahead, from economic immigration to what you could call capital immigration. Despite that trend in some debt-stricken countries, none have left the EU. So coming up, does our guest think that anyone will? But first, your closing market numbers.
Welcome to the future.
Science, technology, innovation. All the latest developments from around Russia.
We've got the future covered.
Welcome back. Before the break, our guest named the problem of economic immigration, where people move for employment within the EU. And there is also, of course, bank deposit immigration, you could call it, where we've seen bank deposits immigrate from, say, Greek banks outside of the country. Greece, of course, an example of a very debt-stricken country with a program that has put it, you could argue, on a deflationary spiral down. Now, despite this and problems like this in other countries, we haven't seen an EU exit, despite the fact that many have predicted we would see one. So I asked our guest, Godfrey, member of the European Parliament, if he's been surprised that no country has left the EU thus far.
Well, the main problem that we have here, which President Barroso referred to today in his State of the Union address, and it's the first time there's been any public acknowledgement, is that we can't go on like this. In the peripheral rim, in the Mediterranean, in Portugal and Spain, southern Italy, Greece, we are talking about 50% youth unemployment. 50%. No society is sustainable when half your people under 25 don't have a job. And of course the reason they don't have a job is because they have currencies which don't align, interest rates that don't align, they have completely different styles and types of economies, different cultural backgrounds, so on and so forth. So this whole thing was doomed from the start. This whole Euro system was doomed from the start. As I said it would be many years ago when I was a guest lecturer at Cambridge University in the 90s, I explained exactly how this would go wrong, why it would go wrong, and in what manner it would go wrong. I would actually have some of the people that have forced this through, this political currency, forced it through, I would have them arraigned. I would like to see, and I've said this on Russia Today before, I would have them arraigned at a fiscal or financial court in The Hague, and I would send some of them to prison. I really would. I'd send some of them to prison.
Well, you know, I think we need a politician like you over here in Congress, right here in Washington. I have to tell you, you know, but I do want to follow up. Do you think we will see a country exit the Eurozone, or do you think that's off the table, that's behind us? And if you think a country is still going to exit, because it sounds like you think the Eurozone is going to break down, is that going to come near term, say this year or next year?
Well, it has to break in some form. It can't go on as it is, because what happens if the mainstream media, who don't understand these things as you understand them on your program and some of your programs, is that what they don't understand is that it doesn't matter how many G10 or G20 summits you have, it doesn't matter how much talking you do over the weekend in Davos and all the rest of it, if you're broke, you're broke, and we're broke. You can't talk your way out of this sort of corner. And as soon as we need to get back to real money, asset-backed, I would argue, money, sound money, real interest rates, the abandonment of welfarism and the way it's not just social welfarism, it's corporate welfarism. I mean, there's as many people in my country, rich landowners, getting energy subsidies and farming and landowning subsidies as there are people out of work. So it's not just social welfare, it's corporate welfare. We need to get rid of that sort of thing. We need to get back to small government. Government's not interfering in our lives as much as they do. Fewer regulations. This is the only way the economy can grow, and it cannot be sustained as it's going at the moment. And of course, what may happen, the danger of these things happening, of course, as you know, is when societies break down, you get extremist politics.
Right.
And this is how, and if you go back to the 1930s, this is where it all started, and I can't believe that Europe's done it again, and they've done it to themselves.
Okay, and we'll have to see if there is an exit, because I couldn't get you pinned down on that, but I do want to move on, because as someone who understands financial markets, and this touches on something we talked about earlier, have you been surprised by the way markets have reacted more broadly to central bank intervention, particularly in Europe? It appears traders reward currencies managed by reckless central banks rather than punishing them in the foreign exchange markets based on fundamentals. In your career as a financial professional and politician, have you ever seen markets so distorted?
Well, my opinion, I would say this, wouldn't I, because I'm old now, but when I was in investment banking, I knew my job. And I've got a feeling now that these days in international investment banking we have a lot of children who don't really know what they're doing, and consequently you see currency movements moving in completely the wrong direction. The euro should be moving down, not up. And stock markets, of course, investors are being forced into stock markets because there's this search for yield. There is no yield in bonds. There's no sovereign bonds who are producing a yield, so they're being forced into the stock market, which moved the prices of stocks up. But this is a purely temporary phenomenon. And they will crash as soon as the children in the city of London and probably New York and Hong Kong suddenly realise actually just how things work. At the moment they don't. They've all been to college, they've done Keynesian economics, and they don't really know very much, bless their cotton socks, and most of them are terribly overpaid.
I'm not going to disagree with you there. Before we go quickly, this does beg the question of how and when we return to a market where prices more accurately reflect reality without crashing the entire system. Maybe as we are on the 20th anniversary of the week known as Black Wednesday in the UK, where speculators crashed the British pound, so to speak, are there any lessons?
Well, there should be a lesson, shouldn't there? When we crashed out of the ERM in 1992, October 92, as soon as we came away from that artificial peg to the Deutschmark which we had, it was totally artificial, the economy then, excuse me, had interest rates and money supply and all the other things that go up to make an economy, which was suitable for the United Kingdom. And if you look at the graphics, and I'm sure you have, from 1992 to the year 2000, our economy shot forward, it lurched forward. And you would see the same thing with the Iberian Peninsula and Greece if they were out of the straitjacket of this appalling Euro experiment. Suddenly it would be cheap to go to Spain, cheap to go to Portugal for your holidays, cheap to go to Greece, so on and so forth, cheap to run an IT company in Dublin. These countries have to come out, but just coming out, the cheap shot of devaluation is not nearly enough. They need to understand that they cannot pay themselves more than they actually earn, and they need to learn the lessons from that. And I would argue that they should go on to hard currencies as well, learn the lesson.
Tough lessons that the generation now has to learn that he blamed on the older generation for racking up so much debt, which I would argue in some countries that sovereign debt would constitute odious debt. That was Godfrey Bloom, member of European Parliament, with that analysis. Okay, let's wrap up with loose change. What do you say, Dimitri Kofinas? Because I know you're excited about this story. Let's talk about the iPhone. People have been antsy over the latest iPhone announcement, but it has finally arrived.
The new iPhone 5 is just 7.6 millimeters thin. That's 18% thinner than the iPhone 4S. And best of all, it's the world's thinnest smartphone.
Big whoop. Who cares that it's the world's thinnest iPhone? But hey, if that'll sell more iPhones, I guess they're going to go with it. And some, such as JP Morgan, believes that that slim phone could help to generate so much in the way of sales that that new iPhone could add up, or could up GDP growth by 0.5%, that they could add to GDP growth to that extent. So does this make Apple too big to fail, Dimitri? It's the question you were so excited to bring up. So maybe I should have let you ask that, but I'll let you answer it.
I just wanted to make the graphic. We got King Kong here. He's, so, you know, the Big Apple, right? The Big Apple, New York. And then he's got Apple in his hand, so Apple's too big to fail. I don't know if they're too big to fail. I know we got Reggie Middleton, a smart guy on the show. He thinks there's a lot of Apple hype. There probably is. I mean, they're brilliant marketers. They're great. And you know what? I desperately want the new iPhone. I don't know why. All right? I don't even know if I like the shape.
You're a sucker.
I am a sucker. I love it. I'm a sucker for Apple. Love you, Apple. And I can't wait.
I'm going to go wait. With this shameless plugging.
I've been begging our producers here. I want to do remotes from the Apple Store.
Oh, God.
I want to wait online. I need an excuse to wait online.
You know what? I would just wonder if what's driving this whole conversation of too big to fail based on this JP Morgan prediction has to do with JP Morgan's predilection towards size and large size, because Jamie Dimon has been out saying that size does matter for banks, and he's making the argument that the bigger bank, the better.
The bigger the better, that's what I've heard too.
Bigger is not better. That's supposed to be the thing, that bigger is not always better.
Okay, all right.
And with banks, that definitely applies.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know.
Okay, you're just tapped out of this story. So let's move on, because I don't want to talk to myself. We spoke about college and education a little bit in this segment, having to do with employment, with my guest. These days, the value of college in America is being questioned, and this is in part, of course, because of rising student loan debt, more than $1 trillion in it. Many financial experts are saying college may just not be worth it. Take a look.
The rising cost of college has changed the equation, so college is less affordable and less good of an investment, I think, than it was 5 or 10 years ago.
Which is something that has become part of the discussion in the U.S. for sure. But guess what? The U.S. is not alone. And we just have a minute, Dimitri. I'm going to warn you. But South Korea, there's an article in Bloomberg that South Korean youth are coming out of college, going to the top schools, and they can't find jobs at the top companies
that's like 30 seconds
when
now.
they used to.
Lauren, you know this story is going to get me worked up. You're only giving me half of it. You know, everyone in our audience knows that I think that education is BS. Pure BS, like the dumbest people ever. Yeah.
Is that what you thought when you went to NYU and spent 4 years there and graduated from university?
I was having fun. It was
degree?
The vast majority of learning I did outside of the. I had to unlearn. University is a negative education. You have to spend years trying to unlearn the stuff that you learn. So
okay.
Yeah, it's a waste of time. Don't do it, kids. Don't waste your time. God.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, I'll just let him get that final word in, because that's all we have time for. Dimitri, you win today. Thank you so much for watching, though, and have a great night. And in the meantime, you know you can follow me on Twitter at Lauren Lister. Give us feedback at youtube.com/Capital Account. Watch us in HD on Hulu. And from everyone here at Capital Account, have a great night.